We focus on these 307 items and a sample of those that have the highest weight. All the 307 items, if you put their weights together, they should match up to 100%. So we've picked the top 10 items with the highest weight, starting with car hire, which is previously we're reporting as bass and trotro first, cooked rice, up to fish that we get from the river, constituting the top 10 items with the highest weight, and looked at the year-on-year inflation and their month-on-month inflation. So the item with the highest weight of 5.8% recorded a change in price of 33.3%, which is just about 3.9 percentage difference between the national average and the item-specific year-on-year inflation of 33.3%. Public-private secondary school and herrings, specifically smoked herrings, were the two items of the 10 items that has the highest weight, recording the highest rate of inflation of 52.1% and 53.4%. On a month-on-month basis, we identify bread recording the highest month-on-month change in price of 23.2%. The other thing that we're doing in this release, as I indicated earlier on, is to provide to our colleagues in the media two clarifications based on news that have been carried either on social media or print or online media. We all probably have heard of the Steve Hanke purchasing power parity approach to the computation of consumer inflation, and Ghana Statistical Service approach of using CPI. This is the first clarification that we want to put out. Steve Hanke's approach is not based on consumer price index. Steve Hanke's approach is based on the purchasing power parity. Underlying the purchasing power parity is the assumption that price differences between two countries is only the exchange rate. So the data that he uses for the computation of consumer inflation is strictly the purchasing power parity, which is based on exchange rate. So he gets his exchange rate data based on official forex data that resides in the countries that he's focusing on, and where this official forex data is not available, data is sourced from the black market. The key difference here is that the CPI approach necessarily requires that we collect data on three variables: prices, quantities, and the expenditure weight on these items. And this is a sharp variance with the Steve Hanke purchasing power parity. So the premise of the computation, both from a data source point of view and a scope of data point of view, are not the same. So we need not make an attempt to compare that. Moving to why Ghana is sticking to the CPI approach, we go beyond the argument that it is consistent with international standards and identify with the reason why it is superior to the Steve Hanke purchasing power parity approach. Any method that seeks to compute consumer price index and does not have the weights simply is not taking into consideration the importance of the items to people who are consuming it. So now one is not too sure the scope of items that we have data on, which are internationally tradable and internationally comparable. So if you pick an item such as bass and trotro fish, which is not easily internationally comparable between Ghana and the United States, it's difficult to say that you are using the purchasing power parity to compute inflation, which is one of the items that have the highest weight when it comes to computation of CPI and rate of inflation in the country. There are a lot more other commodities that you can think about that are country-specific. Our liking for momone, our liking for kobe, our liking for kenke, most of these items are not internationally tradable and are not internationally comparable. So as an institution, we'll continue to stick with the consumer price index as basis for the computation of consumer inflation. The other clarification is a World Bank report that came out early this week, which is on the African Pulse report, which did indicate that prices of food items across different countries is led by, in terms of increases, is led by Ghana. In that report, if you look at it carefully, it doesn't put the percentage changes in prices in the report. What you have in the report is the index. And here the caution is we need to be careful interpreting the index as percentage changes relative to the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation is computed from changes in the consumer price index. So we don't have to interpret the consumer price index as percentage changes. So in that report, it did indicate that food prices in Ghana in June 2022, so food price index in Ghana June 2022 was 122. How they got 122, if you look at what we have on the right-hand side, is as of January 2022, our CPI was 141.9. June 2022, our CPI was 172.4. If you find the relative change between January 2022 and June 2022, you get 122 as the consumer price index. In terms of price changes, this constitutes only a 22% change between January 2022 and June 2022. If you compare it with what we had last month, that is August 2022, using January 2022 as a base year, that is a CPI of 141.9 for January 2022 and August 2022, 181.3, it compares favorably with a 34.4 year-on-year inflation, which we announced in our August release. We are cautioning against comparing the September release with previous releases, consistent with what we do anytime we do a rebase. The reason simply being that now our reference period is not 2018, our reference period is 2021, because we started collecting prices for all the 16 administrative regions in the month or in the year 2021. We'll proceed with CPI and rate of inflation for the month of September 2022. Do disaggregations at two levels. One, we do disaggregations based on the 13 dominant divisions for the computation of rate of inflation, and do disaggregation focusing on subclasses for food items and also disaggregation from a geographical point of view. We're going to end this release with highlights of CPI and rate of inflation for the month of September 2022. Consumer Price Index measures changes in the price of a fixed basket of goods and services that are purchased by households. And this fixed basket of goods and services is obtained from our Living Standard Survey. The inherent assumption is that the basket is purchased each month, so once price changes, the total price of the basket would also change. We compute the rate of inflation by looking at the consumer price index between two time periods, either on a month-on-month basis or on a year-on-year basis. Inflation is reported either annually or monthly, and granulation is done at the regional level, type, and source of commodity. CPI, we emphasize that it does not measure price levels. As was mentioned earlier on, it is changes in prices either on a month-on-month basis and on a year-on-year basis. One of the changes that we've done with our background presentation is to point our users of the data to the international best practices for the computation of consumer price index and rate of inflation. This is informed by recent news either in the print media or social media on how consumer price index and rate of inflation is computed. So we find the need to point readers to the International Manual for Computation of Consumer Price Index and Rate of Inflation. At the end of this slide, we point readers also to our technical manual, that is Ghana Statistical Service in-house technical manual for the computation of consumer price index and rate of inflation. Data for the computation of consumer price index and rate of inflation is captured on a monthly basis based on market reading. Here specifically we are making reference to prices and quantities, which are two of the three variables that we use in the computation of consumer price index and rate of inflation. The third variable that we use for the computation of CPI and rate of inflation are the expenditure weight, which signifies the importance that we put on the items that we consume on a monthly basis. And this is obtained from the Ghana Living Standard Survey, where the recent data was collected in 2017-2018. Price reference here for this new series is 2021, and again, as was indicated, it wasn't 2018, so comparison should henceforth start from 2022, specifically September 2022. This release focuses on the transition of consumer price index and rate of inflation from the 10 administrative regions to the 16 administrative regions. So we go through some computational considerations that we had to undertake to arrive at CPI and rate of inflation for the 16 administrative regions. The first is readjustment of the regional weight. As we would all recall, in 2017-2018, when data was collected for the Ghana Living Standard Survey, it was based on the 10 administrative regions that we have. So moving into the 16 administrative regions, there is the need to readjust the weight for specifically the regions that currently have more regions relative to the old regions. And this we are referring to the northern region, the former northern region, the former Brongahafo region, the former Volta region, which we've seen changes in their configuration in terms of the regions that we have in these regions. The second consideration is the replacement and inclusion of market and outlets. Consistent with our previous releases, we always indicate that we collect data from 44 markets and 7,726 outlets. Based on the adjustment and the new regions that we're currently dealing with, we had to replace some of these markets, especially those that had collapsed between 2018 and 2022, and also included markets and outlets in our new regions that we currently have, that is the 6 new administrative regions. Variation in price year was considered, and as I indicated, we're currently dealing with a reference period of 2021 and not 2018, as we have been doing in the past month. We put emphasis on this because it affects comparisons historically. So here we can only do comparison when we've done the chain linking, which in other contexts we say we've backcasted our price indices to enable us compare the old series with the new series. This is not a full-blown rebasing exercise, because once you are doing a full-blown rebasing exercise, you need to do a new survey, you need to get weight for all the different items, and also update the basket of goods and services that are consumed by persons in households. So this is only a change in the reference year from 2018 to 2021. Representativeness of items and across regions were considered. Based on the exercise that we did, we took advantage of outlets that had collapsed, items that we didn't have in some regions, and updated them in the course of the new data collection to ensure that we have representativeness across items in our 16 administrative regions. So these were the 4 computational considerations that went into the transitioning from 10 to 16 administrative regions for the computation of CPI and rate of inflation. Specifically, we looked at the weight from the old configuration of administrative regions. So Western region had an old weight of 9.2. As an example, we have redistributed this 9.2 old weight into 7.3 for Western region and 1.9 for Western North. Another example is that the Volta region, based on the old series, had a weight of 5.9, and we've readjusted this weight with Volta region having 4.5 and OT region having 1.4. So if you sum up the various weights across the old 10 administrative regions and the 16 new regions, both will sum up to 100. The process by which we did this readjustment were based on the districts that have been reallocated to the new regions that were in the old region. So for instance, in OT region, we looked at the number of districts that were in the old Volta region but now constitute OT region, and based on the sampling, did a reweighting accordingly. And that is why we see variations in the regions that have been subdivided based on the transitioning from the old regions to the new regions. This means that instead of 39,500 products based on the brands that we collect prices on, this has increased to 47,877. We've increased the number of markets from 44 to 57 markets. We've added 13 new markets. And as I indicated, this is purely as a result of the data collection that we had to embark on.
Thank you for watching Nation One TV. Kindly subscribe for more news updates.